I know you've heard this story before. It's not only familiar, but famous and well-loved and overpreached. Everyone knows the parable of the prodigal son. It's not only the most well-known story in Scripture, but one of the most well-known stories in human history. It has inspired millions and has been reimagined by the greatest and most influential artists the world has ever seen. Donatello sculpted it. Chaucer loved it. Rembrandt painted it twice. Shakespeare alluded to it more than any other story. It was Dickens' favorite tale. Thoreau claimed that it was the greatest piece of literature ever written. Countless sermons have been preached on it. Lives have been changed by it. Volumes of books have been written dedicated to understanding its meaning. It has become so ingrained in the collective conscience of Western culture that we employ its themes today without even knowing where they came from. For centuries, this parable has been called Evangelium in Evangelio, the gospel within the gospel, and nearly everyone who wrestles with it ends up with a sense of awe at its inexhaustible content. One scholar wrote, while Jesus was not a philosopher or theologian in the accepted sense, his parables alone provide material that neither the philosopher nor the theologian can exhaust, which is the mark of supreme genius. Those of you who have read Henry Nouwen, which I know is many, will know that this story isn't just about the prodigal son either, but about the father and the older brother. And most of you, I know, already know that the prodigal son is not the title of this story, but an apocryphal heading that was added by Jerome for his Latin translation in 382 AD. There are no titles in the Greek New Testament. Titles tend to put stories in cages and domesticate them until they become easy and mundane and impotent. Titles can be dangerous. A title won't do for a parable. A parable cannot be managed or contained by a title. Show me a parable with a title and I will show you a dead parable. Jesus told this parable without a title, and then we tried to help Jesus out by giving it a title. But Jesus doesn't need our help to tell a good story. And the title that we came up with narrows the story and privileges one member of the family. And when you focus on only one member of the family, you start to think that that one person represents the history of an entire group of people. But this is not just the story about the younger son. It is a story about the whole family, the whole house. And families are way more complex than this title suggests. We've heard this story so many times, it's hard for us to try to open ourselves up to it again. And the French philosopher Paul Ricoeur describes this experience as a critical part of our spiritual journey. He said we move through three stages of development in our lives: a first naivete, a critical distance, and a second naivete. In the first naivete, we read the story on a literal, surface-level reading. Then in the second stage, historical criticism confronts our simple and naive readings, and literal meanings that we hold will not hold up under rational scrutiny, and they must be deconstructed. And this happens to most of us in college or in seminary for ministers, or for some of you during J21, I'm sure. Ricoeur says, if we stay in this second phase of critical distance, though, we become alienated from the story and it loses all of its power and significance for our lives. So Ricoeur challenges us to move to the third phase, the second naivete, where we are invited to go beyond the desert of criticism and allow the story to call to us again. Can we let this story call to us again today? Can we wipe the slate clean of what we've heard, bracket our preconceived notions, and hear it anew? You know the parable of the prodigal son, but have you heard the story of the house? Have you heard the story of the family and the household and the community around it? What did they think about what was going on between the father and his sons? Scholar Kenneth Bailey, who studied Middle Eastern culture his entire life, says that in all of Middle Eastern literature, from ancient times to the present, there is no case ever recorded of a son asking for his inheritance from a father who was still in good health. It was unheard of and incredibly insulting. It meant the son wanted the father to die. He was basically saying, "Drop dead, Dad." And a first-century audience in that culture would have been scandalized by this unthinkable request. After the son asked for the inheritance, people would have expected the next thing Jesus said to be, "And the father beat the living tar out of his son." In that culture, the father would have not only been expected to refuse his son's request, but to punish him severely for the sake of himself, for the family, and for the whole community. And so, as if we are not already in deep water, then comes the first twist in the story from Jesus. The father agrees to the son's request. And the crowd listening to Jesus' story would have found this unimaginable and preposterous. Giving away half of his resources at that point in his life would have impacted everyone in the family, especially the women and children. Also, out of respect for his father, the older son in those days would have been expected at that point to refuse his own share of the inheritance and step in as a mediator to try and reconcile his brother to his father. But he, of course, is nowhere to be seen at this point in the story and fails on both counts. His resentment is already seething as the family is fractured. This parable is not like the lost sheep or the lost coin that came before it, where one is lost and many are left behind. Long before the younger son ever left the house, everyone in this story was lost to each other. The father is lost to his sons. Brother is lost to brother. The sons were lost to their father. This isn't the story of one lost son. It is the story of an entire house that is lost. Can you imagine what the neighbors said? In that first century culture built on honor and shame, everyone in this story would have been considered dishonorable. The entire family would have been subject to public shame. They would have been overlooked. Maybe they have overlooked the father for being a little impetuous. They may have overlooked the brother for being self-righteous and angry. But they would not have forgiven the son because he took his inheritance that could have benefited the whole community, left his family and his country behind, and squandered that inheritance in Gentile territory, in an economic system where his frivolousness would not have benefited anyone of his own kin. For generations, scholars and preachers have been obsessed with the pigs and the prostitutes in this story. Seems like a strange obsession to me. They'd say things like squandering his money was bad, but wasting it on prostitutes, only to end up eating with unclean pigs, was unforgivable. How quickly we readers become like the older brother. The narrator never mentions prostitutes. That false accusation comes later from the lips of a resentful brother explaining what he thinks happened. And the pigs, simply an illustration of how dire life is during a famine for the poor. No, the truly unforgivable sin in the eyes of the community were not the pigs or the prostitutes, but that the son took his inheritance, left home with it, and squandered the money in a foreign country. In fact, Palestinian communities had a ceremony that they used to punish someone who left home and sold their possessions to the Gentiles. And it was called the Kisasa ceremony. Losing family property to Gentiles was a serious matter. Any son who violated this principle was dealt with in radical fashion. The Kisasa ceremony is described in the Talmud, where it states, if a man sells his field to a Gentile, you are to bring barrels full of ashes, parched corn, and nuts. They're very specific here. Gather the whole community, especially the children, so they can watch, and break open the jar at the man's feet and proclaim, "This man is cut off from his people." The purpose of the Kisasa ceremony was to say, if you leave, you better leave for good, or you will face humiliation when you return. The Kisasa was still in practice in Jesus' day to discourage people from leaving home and wasting resources in a foreign country. And so when a person who left and tried to come home would be seen off in the distance, they would take a jar, fill it with burnt nuts and wheat, and run up to them and smash the pot at their feet and say, "You cannot return. You are banned forever." You know why the community performed the Kisasa, don't you? If they didn't perform the Kisasa, first it would be your son, and then it would be my son, and then it would be the whole youth group. The whole youth group would be doing it if we didn't have some practice to discourage this kind of behavior. So they said, if you ever leave in a disrespectful or dishonorable way, then you're done for good. Every society has its own Kisasa ceremony, don't they? Here in America, we have performed the Kisasa many times. It used to be performed on daughters who became pregnant as teenagers or found themselves in need of an abortion. It has been performed on youth many times who have been kicked out of their homes for coming out as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. It has also been performed on family members who get involved with drugs and alcohol, who make bad economic decisions. Sometimes the Kisasa looks like one spouse leaving another. Other times the Kisasa is performed over time as a process where harsh words and callous actions and family disputes go unresolved for years and years and years. If you've ever been the victim of the Kisasa, or if you've ever performed the Kisasa, then you know what it means to be lost, like this family was. When the younger son came to his senses, he decided he would go home and become a servant of his father. So he created a prepared confession, still thinking that he could save himself, or that money was the real problem, not realizing that it was the relationships he damaged that needed to be mended. The younger son knew, of course, that the Kisasa ceremony awaited him if he returned to his village. He fully expected that the village would probably cut him off, and he had no solution to this problem, but he was hungry. So he prepared his speech and braced himself and began his journey anyway, empty-handed and dying of hunger. It's really his heart. It's really not his heart, but his stomach that's driving him to come back home. The father also knew how the village would treat his son. A crowd would gather spontaneously as word flashed around the village of his return, and they would come and smash the jars of burnt trash and ashes at his feet and tell him that he was cut off forever. If he returned, he would face the Kisasa. The slander of the whole town and the gathering of a mob would surround him. His entry would be humiliating and ruthless as the pent-up hostilities of the community were vented on him for mocking their cultural traditions, losing their precious resources among foreigners and Gentiles. He might even be stoned to death, which happened as a part of the Kisasa from time to time. And so the father, knowing of the Kisasa, watched on the horizon for any sign of his son. Maybe he watched on occasion, or maybe he watched every day and every night, over the hills and across the plains, looking longingly, in hope and fear, for the son that he had lost, for the son that he was lost to. Aristotle once said, "Great men never run in public." A Middle Eastern nobleman with flowing robes would never run anywhere. To do so was undignified and humiliating. A woman might run, a mother might run, but not a man or a father. It was uncouth. But Jesus said, as he told the story, while the son was still far off, the Father saw him and was filled with compassion, and he ran. He ran. He saw his son in the distance. He left his house behind and he ran. He did one of those things patriarchs never do. He took off running. He did what great men supposedly never do. He pulled up his robes and he ran like a mother toward his son. He was not concerned with indignities or humiliating himself in the process. He simply ran the gauntlet for his son. And why did the father run? Did he run out of compassion? Yes. But he also ran for his son's protection. The father was thinking to himself, if only I can get to my son before the village gets to him. If only I can embrace him and kiss him and put my robe on him and my ring on his finger where everyone in town can see it, maybe I can save him from the kisasa. Maybe I can protect him from the wrath of the village. Maybe I can spare him the shame and humiliation of returning home empty-handed. If I throw a huge party for the whole town, maybe I can keep him safe from their violence and rejection. If I can just get to him before they do and put myself between him and the village, then maybe, just maybe, I can bring him back home into the family. And so the father ran. He ran like the wind and beat the village to his son. And he prevented the kisasa from taking place. And when the son started speaking, the father wouldn't let him finish his sentence before declaring that what was dead had been resurrected, and what has been lost has now been found, and it is time for a celebration. This is what love looks like, isn't it? It's difficult for us to imagine a more dramatic illustration of the quality of love the gospel demands. It is a love that loves before it is loved in return. It is a love that runs headlong in compassion with no concern for dignity. It is a love that forgives before forgiveness is requested. A love that does not wait for an apology to offer grace. A love that heaps extravagant gifts on those who've squandered all they have. A love that embraces the ones who once rejected us. A love that offers new life to those who wished our death. A love that overturns tradition and breaks the culture of shame. A love that seeks to protect the one the community wants to harm. A love that leaves the house to restore what has been lost. A love that goes off to bring people back together and welcome everyone into the family. Not everyone responds well to that kind of love. When he saw the father's love, the older brother left home, just like his younger brother. He separated himself from the family, and so the father would have to leave home again to go out and find another son who was lost and try to lead him to come back in. But the father did it again. And so is the nature of love. Many have said that the older son is the Pharisee, and that the younger son is the sinner, and the father is God. And of course, as you know, this interpretation is usually accompanied by an altar call, an arousing rendition of the old gospel hymn, softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling poor sinner, come home. But this parable is not about repentance. It's not even about coming home to God or Jesus or anyone else for that matter. God's not the father in this story. We are. As wayward as we might be, we need not see ourselves as either of the sons. It is the Father that we are called to be. We are the ones who are called to show extravagant love. The story of the house is not about coming home. It's about leaving the confines of our comfort zone and running out to embrace the ones who we are lost without. The story of the house is the story of the church, of the followers of Jesus, of the family of faith. We are called to open up the doors of this house, to go out from here, to love the unloved, to protect the vulnerable, to accept the unacceptable, to extend prodigal generosity to people who have lost everything that they have. We are called to run out into the world like the Father, with no bitterness or arrogance, judgment or shame, but with an outpouring of unexpected and extravagant love. And we don't have to worry about being dignified or noble. We can hike up our robes and run like the wind of the Holy Spirit, knowing that the church is not just in here. The church is out there as well. And if we go out of this place with open arms and generous hearts filled with love, ready to celebrate with joy, we will not just restore the family of God to one another, but we will build an even bigger house than we already have. And in the process, we will surely discover, as this family in this story did, that we who once were dead can come alive again. And we who once were lost can now be found. Amen.